As we begin to explore the profound truth that God's path is the best path, I want to address a common temptation we all face. The temptation to trust in our own way and our own understanding, rather than fully trusting in the path that God has set before us. Friends, we are all familiar with the feeling of wanting things to go our way. It's natural. It's human. When we face decisions or challenges in life, we often find ourselves turning inward, asking, what is it that I want? What is it that I think is best for me? It's easy to get caught up in our own desires, our own timelines, and our own ideas about how life should unfold. But I've learned something powerful over the years. Our way is often not the best way. I can remember a time in my own life when I was making a big decision, one that seemed so clear to me at the time. It was a path that seemed right, a path that seemed to align perfectly with my desires and plans. I had a vision of what the future would look like, and I thought I knew exactly how to get there. So I pursued that path with everything I had. But as time passed, I began to realize that the way I thought was best wasn't leading me to the peace I had hoped for. Instead, it was leading me to frustration, to confusion, and to moments of doubt. It was in that season of struggle that I came to understand a vital truth. Our path, while it may seem right, is often misguided because we don't see the full picture. We can't see what God sees. And it's in those moments, those times when we're trying to go our own way, that we realize just how limited our understanding is. Proverbs 14:12 speaks directly to this human experience, saying, "There is a way that appears to be right, but in the end it leads to death." This verse is a sobering reminder that our desires, our plans, and our wisdom, while they may seem good in the moment, are often not the best path for us. I know from personal experience how easy it is to follow the path that feels comfortable or familiar. But God, in His infinite wisdom, sees the beginning from the end. He sees the obstacles that we can't see, the struggles we don't foresee, and He knows the perfect path for our lives. When we choose our way, we risk going down a road that leads to heartache, disappointment, and sometimes even spiritual decline. This is why trusting in God's path is so crucial, because He knows exactly what we need, and He is leading us toward a future filled with purpose, peace, and His everlasting love. It's not always easy to relinquish control and trust in God's plan. There's a part of us that wants to take the reins, to decide the direction of our lives, to shape our future with our own hands. And yet, when we do that, we often end up in places we didn't expect, places that leave us feeling empty, disillusioned, and wondering where God went. But I've also experienced the peace and joy that comes from surrendering my plans to God and trusting that His path, even when it doesn't align with my timing or expectations, is the best path for me. One of the most powerful experiences in my life was when I finally let go of my own vision for my future and trusted God completely. I didn't know where He was leading me, and I didn't know where He was leading me, and I didn't understand why things weren't happening the way I thought they should, but I chose to follow Him anyway. And in doing so, I found a peace that surpassed anything I had ever known. I realized that God's path wasn't about me getting everything I wanted. It was about Him shaping me into the person He had called me to be. Friends, I'm here to tell you today that God's path for your life is the best path. It may not always be the easiest path, and it may not always make sense to us, but it is the path that leads to true fulfillment. And it's a path that leads to Him. When we trust in God's path, we are saying, Lord, I trust that You know better than I do. I trust that You see what I cannot see, And I believe that your way is the way of peace, purpose, and blessing. It's a decision to surrender our will to His, to let go of our own plans, and to embrace the journey that He has laid out for us, knowing that every step He guides us through is for our good and for His glory. So, as we reflect on the path we're on today, let's ask ourselves, are we trusting in our own understanding, or are we willing to trust in God's perfect path, even when we can't see the way ahead? Are we willing to follow Him no matter where He leads, knowing that His path will lead to a future far greater than anything we could ever imagine? Let's trust Him today. Let's choose His path, knowing that it is the best path, and that in Him we find peace, joy, and the fulfillment of all that He has promised. As we continue to reflect on the profound truth that God's path is the best path, I want to take a moment to delve into a critical aspect of trusting God's plan. Understanding that His plan is not only the best path, but it is also perfectly tailored for our lives. One of the most difficult things we face as followers of Christ is the realization that God's plan may not align with our own desires, expectations, or timelines. It is human nature to want things to happen according to our schedule, to demand answers on our terms, and to push forward with our plans regardless of the detours that might come our way. I know I have been there. I've had moments where I could clearly see what I wanted, what I thought was best for me, and how I believed my life should unfold. I had a vision of success, of peace, and of joy that I was striving toward, but it wasn't happening as quickly or in the way I had imagined. It was in those moments of frustration, in those moments of feeling like I was running in circles, that God gently reminded me that His plan, though it may seem delayed or even unclear at times, was not only better than my own, it was also perfectly suited to who I am and the purpose He has for my life. I remember a season in my life when I found myself waiting for an opportunity, waiting for a door to open, waiting for a breakthrough. And during that waiting, it seemed as though everything was moving forward for everyone else but me. I prayed fervently, asking God for clarity, for a sign, for anything that would give me direction. And yet the path ahead remained unclear. The doors didn't open when I thought they should, and the answers didn't come in the timeline I had imagined. It was easy to become frustrated, to feel like I was stuck in a holding pattern, wondering if I had somehow missed God's plan for me. But in that season, God taught me an invaluable lesson. His plan was not about instant gratification. It was about deepening my trust in Him and His timing. Jeremiah 29:11 reminds us of this truth. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you a hope and a future. This verse became a lifeline for me during those times of waiting. It was a reminder that God's plan for my life was always about my ultimate good, even when I couldn't see the full picture. He wasn't withholding blessings from me. He was shaping me, preparing me for the future He had already mapped out. And this is where our faith is tested. We want God to show us the full path ahead. We want clarity. We want certainty. But more often than not, God only gives us the next step. And in that uncertainty, we must choose to trust Him. His plan is not a static, one-size-fits-all path. It's a personalized journey that fits our needs, our growth, and our calling. Sometimes We may not understand why certain things happen or why we have to wait. I know I've asked myself, why is this taking so long? God, why does it seem like everything I've prayed for is delayed? But I've learned that God's delays are not denials. He has a reason for the timing, a reason for the wait, and a reason for the way He directs our steps. There is a beautiful truth I've come to realize. God is not just leading us to a destination. He is leading us through a process. And that process is where He does His most profound work in us. Think about the story of Abraham. God promised him that he would be the father of many nations, but the fulfillment of that promise didn't come overnight. Abraham had to wait. He had to trust. And the waiting didn't just build his faith, it refined it. Each delay, each step of the journey deepened Abraham's trust in God's faithfulness. It wasn't the destination that God was focused on. It was the process, the development of Abraham's faith that was of utmost importance. And the same is true for us. God's path for our lives isn't about a straight line from point A to point A to point B. It's about a journey that requires trust, growth, and sometimes even waiting. But the waiting is never wasted. It's in those moments of uncertainty that God is doing His best work in us. He is shaping our character, developing our patience, and teaching us to rely not on our own understanding, but on His perfect will. And when we finally reach the destination, we will look back and see that the journey was just as important as the promise. I think of the Israelites who spent 40 years wandering in the wilderness before entering the promised land. For many of them, it must have seemed like a frustrating and confusing delay. Yet, in those 40 years, God was preparing them for what was ahead. He was teaching them to trust Him, to depend on Him for their daily needs, and to obey His commands. The wilderness wasn't a detour. It was part of God's perfect plan. The Israelites couldn't see it at the time, but they needed that time of preparation. And I believe the same is true for us. We might not always understand why things are taking longer than we expected, why our path doesn't seem to be moving in the direction we envisioned. But in those moments, we can trust that God is preparing us for something greater. He is shaping us, molding us, and equipping us for the future He has designed. So, friends, if you find yourself on a path that feels uncertain, if you're in a season of waiting, or if you're struggling to understand why things are unfolding the way they are, I want to encourage you today. Trust that God's plan for you is the best plan for you is the best plan. Trust that He knows the way, even when you can't see it. His timing is perfect. His path is perfect. And even though it may feel like the journey is taking longer than you expected, remember that the process is just as important as the destination. God is doing something in you right now. And when the time is right, you will see how everything He has allowed, every twist, every turn, every delay was part of His perfect plan. So lean into His path, trust Him with the journey, and know that the future He is leading you to will be more than you could ever ask or imagine. As we continue to explore the truth that God's path is the best path, we must turn our attention to one of the most challenging aspects of trusting in God's plan. God's timing. Reality is, God's timing is often much different from ours. We live in a world that moves at a fast pace. We are conditioned to want things immediately. We want the promotion today. We want the promotion today. We want the promotion today. We want the breakthrough to come as soon as possible. We pray, we ask, and we believe that God is going to answer our requests in our timing. But here's the truth I've had to learn through personal experience. God doesn't operate on our timeline. God's plan unfolds in His perfect time, not ours. I remember a season in my life when I was facing a situation that required me to make a decision. I was praying earnestly, seeking God's direction, and I wanted answers immediately. The clock was ticking, and the pressure to make the right choice was growing. But week after week, I found myself waiting. I had my own plans, my own schedule, but God wasn't moving according to my timetable. I couldn't understand why He was delaying. I thought I had a clear vision, and I thought I had a clear vision, and I thought I was prepared for whatever came next. But the answers weren't coming, and I began to grow frustrated. It was in this season of waiting that God taught me one of the most important lessons I've ever learned. God's timing is never late. He may not answer according to our preferred timeline, but He always answers at the perfect time. I remember reading Ecclesiastes 3:11, which says, He has made everything beautiful in its time. I had heard this verse many times before, but it took on a new depth during that period. It wasn't just a pretty phrase. It was a profound truth. God's timing isn't random or arbitrary. It is purposeful and intentional. His timing is always perfect, and He makes everything beautiful in its time. This doesn't mean everything will happen when we want it to, or that things will always go according to our plans. It simply means that God knows what we need, when we need it, and how it will all come together. When we find ourselves waiting for God's answers, we must trust that His timing is for our good. It's easy to feel as though God is slow or indifferent, but I've learned that waiting is part of God's process of growth in our lives. It's in those moments of delay that God is refining us, shaping our hearts, and preparing us for what lies ahead. When I look at the lives of people in Scripture, I see that God's timing played a crucial role in their journeys. Take, for example, Abraham. God had made him a promise that he would be the father of many nations. And yet, Abraham and Sarah had to wait for years before the promise was fulfilled. The waiting seemed unbearable, and at times Abraham took matters into his own hands, trying to fulfill God's promise through his own actions. But God's timing was different. He knew when the right time would come for Isaac to be born. When Sarah was beyond childbearing age, when it seemed impossible, God fulfilled His promise. I'm sure Abraham must have wondered why God was making him wait so long. But the waiting was part of God's plan to show that it was His power and not Abraham's efforts that would bring about the fulfillment of the promise. Then there's the story of Joseph. God gave him dreams as a young man, dreams that one day his family would bow down to him. But instead of the fulfillment of those dreams coming quickly, Joseph went through years of betrayal, slavery, and imprisonment. It must have felt like God had forgotten him. Yet Joseph remained faithful to God throughout his trials. And when the time was right, God exalted him to a position of power in Egypt, just as He had promised. If Joseph had risen to power too soon, he wouldn't have been ready for it. The time of waiting, of trusting in God's plan, was the preparation he needed to fulfill the role God had prepared for him. I've often found myself wondering why God's timing doesn't match my own. There are times when I'm praying for something, and it feels like the heavens are silent. There are times when I can't see how things are going to work out, and I question whether I'm hearing from God or if I've missed something along the way. But the more I reflect on these moments, the more I realize that God's silence is not a sign of abandonment. It's a sign of preparation. It's in the waiting that He is doing a work in us that we cannot always see. Sometimes God delays our prayers not because He is denying us, but because He is preparing us for the answer. He is preparing us for the blessing, for the responsibility, for the opportunity that is coming. And we have to trust that He knows the perfect moment when everything will fall into place. I think of the Apostle Paul, who experienced his own season of waiting. He had a passion to spread the gospel, to preach to the Gentiles, and to see the church grow. But after his conversion, Paul spent several years in obscurity, preparing for the ministry God had called him to. During that time, Paul could have questioned God's timing. He could have wondered why God wasn't opening doors for him right away. But instead, Paul trusted in God's plan and purpose, knowing that God was using that time of waiting to prepare him for the mission that lay ahead. When the time was right, God opened the door, and Paul became one of the greatest evangelists in history. Friends, if you are in a season of waiting, I want to encourage you today to trust in God's timing. I know it's difficult. I know it's frustrating to wait, to feel as though things are moving slowly or not at all. But I want to remind you that God is never late. His timing is perfect, even when we don't understand it. We may not always see the purpose in the delay, but we can trust that God is working behind the scenes, aligning everything according to His perfect plan. Just as He did with Abraham, Joseph, and Paul, He is working in your life, preparing you for the blessings and opportunities that are to come. When the time is right, God will open the door and everything will come together in ways that only He could orchestrate. So trust Him today. Trust His timing. Know that while you wait, He is doing a work in you. He is preparing you, refining you, and positioning you for the future He has for you. And when that time comes, when the door opens, when the promise is fulfilled, you will look back and see how every moment of waiting was part of His perfect plan. As we continue to reflect on the truth that God's path is the best path, we must now look at the vital role that faith and obedience play in our journey. There's no doubt that God has a plan for each of our lives, and that plan is perfect. But the path to fulfilling that plan often requires us to walk by faith, even when we don't see the full picture, and to obey God, even when His direction doesn't make sense. I found that it's in those moments when I don't fully understand where I'm going, when the road ahead is unclear, that God asks me to trust Him more deeply. I think back to a particular time in my own life when I was facing a major decision. I knew that God was calling me to step out in faith, to do something that felt both right and yet uncertain. I had prayed for clarity, but what I received wasn't a clear roadmap. It was a nudge, a gentle prompting to take the first step, even though the rest of the journey was shrouded in uncertainty. I hesitated. I wanted to see the full picture. I wanted to understand what would happen next, how everything would unfold. But in that moment, I felt God's voice quietly reminding me, trust me. Take the step and I will guide you. And so, with a mix of faith and trepidation, I took the first step, and even though I couldn't see the end of the path, God began to open doors, one after the other. What I didn't realize at the time was that each step of obedience was leading me exactly where God wanted me to be. The journey was not without challenges, but it was full of growth, and each step brought me closer to the fulfillment of God's purpose in my life. It was in my obedience that I began to see God's path unfolding in ways I had never imagined. The key lesson here is that our obedience is directly linked to our faith. When we trust God, we are willing to obey Him, even when we don't have all the answers. I've come to understand that faith isn't just about believing that God can do something. It's about trusting Him enough to act on that belief. It's about stepping out even when we don't know exactly what will happen. And the truth is, when we obey God, even in the face of uncertainty, we are aligning ourselves with His best plan for us. I think of Abraham, who was called by God to leave his home and go to a land he didn't know. God didn't give him all the details up front. Abraham didn't know what the future held or how God's promises would unfold. But in Hebrews 11:8, we're told that Abraham, when called to go to a place he would later receive as his inheritance, obeyed and went, even though he did not know where he was going. Even though he did not know where he was going, faithfulness. And that faith led him to the fulfillment of God's promises. Had Abraham refused to obey, had he chosen to stay where he was comfortable, he would have missed out on the incredible blessing God had in store for him. His obedience, even in the face of uncertainty, set him on the path to become the father of nations, just as God had promised. I've also thought about Moses, another great example of faith and obedience. When God called Moses to lead the Israelites out of slavery in Egypt, Moses had every reason to doubt. He was a man who had fled Egypt, a man who had lived in the wilderness for years, a man who didn't feel equipped for the task. In Exodus 3:11, Moses asked God, "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt?" Moses didn't feel qualified. He didn't feel ready. But God didn't call him because of his qualifications. God called him because of His own power and plan. And despite Moses' reservations, he obeyed. And as a result, God used Moses to lead a nation to freedom. Had Moses refused to obey, the story of Israel would have been very different. It was Moses' faith and obedience that allowed God's path to unfold, and through his obedience, God's glory was revealed in powerful ways. In my own life, I've learned that it's easy to want all the answers before we take a step. It's easy to wait for the perfect conditions, to wait until we feel completely ready or until the path is completely clear. But God doesn't always work that way. He calls us to take steps of faith, not based on what we see, but on who He is. When we choose to obey, even in the face of uncertainty, we are affirming that we trust God's plan more than our own understanding. And in those moments, God begins to reveal His path to us in ways that we never could have imagined. Obedience to God's path requires faith, and it requires trust in His sovereignty. When we obey, we're saying to God, "I trust that your plan is better than mine. I trust that you are leading me to a future that I cannot yet see, but that you have already prepared for me." And here's the beautiful part. When we walk in obedience, even when it's difficult, God doesn't leave us to figure it out on our own. His Holy Spirit guides us, gives us strength, and reminds us of His promises every step of the way. It's not always easy to obey, and it's not always comfortable. But the path of obedience is the path that leads to the best life, the life God has for us. One of the most profound things I've learned about God's path is that when we choose to trust and obey, we are not just walking toward a destination. We are walking toward a relationship with Him. As we take each step of faith, we grow closer to God, and His purpose for our lives becomes clearer. It's in obedience that we experience the fullness of God's presence and the joy of walking in His will. The path may not always be easy, but the peace that comes from knowing we are walking in God's will is worth every step. So, my friends, I encourage you today, if you are feeling uncertain about the path God has called you to, take the step of faith. Trust Him enough to obey, even when you don't have all the answers. Believe that God's path is the best path and take a step toward it. As you do, you will find that He will lead you, guide you, and fill you with peace as you walk in His will. His path may be different than what you imagined, but it will always be the best one for you. And when you step out in obedience, you will find that God's plan for your life is more beautiful, more fulfilling, and more amazing than anything you could have ever dreamed. Keep walking, keep trusting, and keep obeying. Because God's path is always the best path, is always the best path. As we come to the final part of our message today on the truth that God's path is the best path, I want to leave you with a message of hope, encouragement, and a call to action that I believe will change your life. Throughout this journey, we've discussed how God's plan for our lives is perfect, even when it doesn't align with our own understanding or expectations. We've seen how trusting in God's timing, walking by faith, and obeying His calling are essential in living the life He has designed for us. But now, as we conclude, I want to invite you to take that truth and put it into action. We're not just called to hear about God's perfect path. We're called to walk it. And walking it requires a step of faith, a willingness to surrender our own desires, and a trust in God that goes beyond understanding. I know that for many of you, this message has been a reminder of the things you already know, that God's way is the best way, that His path is filled with purpose, and that He is guiding you toward a future filled with hope. But I also know that for some of you, this message might be calling you to a deeper level of commitment, a deeper level of surrender. Maybe you're facing a crossroads in your life right now. Perhaps you're at a place where you've been holding on to your own plans and desires, struggling to trust that God's way is better. Or maybe, like me, in certain seasons of life, you found yourself waiting for God to open doors, waiting for answers, waiting for something to shift in your circumstances. But friends, I'm here to tell you today that the best thing you can do in that moment of waiting, in that moment of uncertainty, is to step forward in faith and trust that God's plan for you is already unfolding. It may not look the way you imagined. It may not come as quickly as you hoped. But I promise you, as you surrender to God's path, as you walk in obedience and trust, you will find that His way is far greater than anything you could have ever planned for yourself. I remember a time in my life when I was at a crossroads, unsure of where God was leading me. I was frustrated because the answers weren't coming as quickly as I wanted, and the direction I felt God was calling me to seemed unclear. But in the midst of that uncertainty, God spoke to my heart in a way that I'll never forget. He said, "Trust me and keep moving forward. My path is the best path, and I will guide you step by step, and I will guide you step by step." And that's the key, friends. God doesn't always give us the full picture. He doesn't always show us the entire journey, but He asks us to take that first step. He asks us to trust Him with today, with the next step, with the moment in front of us. And when we do, He leads us forward, guiding us in ways we never could have imagined. Looking back now, I can see how every step of faith, every moment of obedience has brought me closer to the fulfillment of God's plan for my life. It wasn't always easy. There were times when I felt unsure, when I doubted, when I questioned whether I was on the right path. But God's faithfulness has been evident at every turn, and I've learned that His path truly is the best path. It has led me to a place of peace, a place of purpose, and a place of fulfillment that I never could have reached on my own. So what about you today? Where are you in your journey? Are you walking in obedience to God's plan, or are you still trying to make your own way? I know that it can be hard to trust when the path seems unclear, when the road ahead is uncertain, or when the journey is taking longer than you expected. But I wanted to challenge you today to take that step of faith. Trust that God's path for your life is the best one, even when you can't see the end of the road. Surrender your plans to Him, knowing that He has a future for you that is filled with hope, peace, and His love. I encourage you to take a moment today to reflect on where you are and where God is calling you to go. Are there areas of your life where you're holding on to your own plans, resisting God's path for you? Maybe it's in your career, your relationships, or your personal goals. Whatever it may be, I invite you to lay it down at God's feet. Surrender your desires, your timeline, and your own understanding. And your own understanding, and trust that God's way is not only better, but it is the best way. As you do, I believe you will experience a peace that surpasses all understanding, knowing that you are walking in alignment with God's will for your life. Take a step of faith today. Trust in God's timing. Obey His call. Walk in His path, even when it's unclear, even when it's hard. And know that He is with you every step of the way. And as you walk, know this: you are not alone. God is guiding you, strengthening you, and walking beside you. You may not see the full picture now, but one day you will look back and see how every step of faith, every moment of obedience was part of His perfect plan for your life. As we close today, I want to ask you to make a commitment in your heart. Will you trust God with your path? Will you take the next step, no matter how uncertain the road may seem? I believe that as you do, you will experience the joy and peace that come from walking in the center of His will. God's path is the best path, and it will lead you to a future filled with His promises, His blessings, and His love. Trust Him today, and let's walk forward together, knowing that with God leading us, we are on the best path possible.